Being something of a stay-at-home, and where I live, I should probably say a notorious stay-at-home, I'm not only grateful when I see a gathering like this, but touched and even a little bit surprised. My daughter, who is now 26, once said when she was around 16 or so, "Dad, you and all your closest male friends should form a club, and you would hold one meeting a year that all of you would refuse to attend." But if the meeting were in a place like this, it might be hard to roust us out of there. As Zachary said, my new book is called The Unwanted Sound of Everything We Want, which is something of a mouthful for a title. So the subtitle is very simple and direct, a book about noise. And noise is a very topical subject, a subject that I believe is right for our time, and for several reasons, none of which I'm going to mention right now, because I want to leave shy people something for question and answer if they'd like. But it's also a very ancient subject. I think most of you here are familiar with the story of Noah and the ark in the Hebrew Bible. And some of you may also know that that story has a predecessor, and some scholars would say a source, in a book that has the claim to be perhaps the oldest known book in the world, which was written on cuneiform clay tablets sometime between 2,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. And there is a story in there of a flood. And a man builds an ark, and his name is Utnapishtim. And teachers of young children everywhere should be grateful that our source comes from the Hebrew and not from the Sumerian, where they'd have to say Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim builds a boat, and he puts animals on it, and even sends out birds to bring back greenery. But the reason for the destruction, the flood, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, as this story is called, is not stated as the wickedness of humankind, but the noisiness of humankind. The gods are disturbed circa 3000 BCE by noise. And of course, there are some concrete historical reasons why that story would be told in that way, because these first city-states were arising. The Sumerians were probably the first people to field an organized army. They were the first people to have wheeled chariots. They were the first people to have professional ensembles of musicians, and they conceived of their gods as having been annoyed by all of those noises, probably because often they were as well. So here at the beginning of literature, and very close to the beginning of what we would call civilization, we have a story about destruction, and it's related to a story about noise. And I would suggest, and do suggest in my book, that that relationship exists even today. What I'd like to do tonight is to give you a little introduction to my book, and a short walkthrough of the book, just so you know what's in the book. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and then we'll have some questions and answers. And as Zachary said, and this is standard practice for me at any gig like this, I don't leave until the last question is asked, often after the event. But if you can't get your question in during the question and answer period, or you just are not comfortable with that sort of thing, do please come up and see me after the event. As for signing all of the books in the store, we'll have to negotiate how many I get to take home. My book, The Unwanted Sound of Everything We Want, I'm going to describe for you, first of all, by saying what it's not. Okay. First of all, it is not a rant against noise. And you can tell that simply by the title, The Unwanted Sound, and noise is often defined as unwanted sound, of everything we want, which suggests that there's some complexity here and some mystery and some nuance, or at least that was my objective. It is not a textbook. And if it were a textbook, it would not be a science textbook. Its emphases are on politics and history and issues of neighborhood. Nevertheless, it is chock full of facts, figures, dates, some of which are scientific. This is the first book that I've written with endnotes and bibliography. And after doing them all, it may be the last, but that remains to be seen. It is also not a travelogue, although the flap copy mentions a few of many places that are visited, either in my experience or imaginatively in the pages of the book. The reader goes everywhere from the Queen Zoo to a biker bar in Sturgis, South Dakota, from a Portuguese religious festival to the red light district in Amsterdam, from Rocky Mountain National Park to the great reading room of the New York Public Library. And yes, the author did get to visit all of those places. And finally, it's not a how-to book in the sense of you get this book and it tells you how to fight noise. But I did write it with people in mind who were thinking of that question. And I've included lots of practical information in the appendices. And in the narrative of the book itself, I draw upon another project that I used in preparing this and that I was able to set up with the help of a web-savvy former student of mine, which was a website still in operation and still up, called noisestories.com, to which people were able, the man on the street that C.S. Lewis was talking about, were able to send in their stories about noise. And they're still doing it, even though I've made an announcement that the book has been written. And so those stories helped me in all of my ruminations and readings and travels never to go too far away from the practical experience, such as one of my correspondents living downstairs from a kindergarten teacher who was apparently not very happy either with her life or with her neighbor, and in the middle of the night would take an electric drill and drive it into the floor of her apartment in order to get to the person living downstairs. What this book is a sustained, and I would have to say personal, exploration of noise, past and present, and with an eye, but I should say an ear, toward understanding our politics and our present moment as inhabitants of a world in jeopardy. Bill McKibben, a writer and a thinker for whom I have a great deal of respect, favored me by saying that this is a book for our precise moment on Earth. And it's hard to think of a combination of saying and source that would be dearer to a writer's heart. So let's talk a little bit, just briefly, about the parts of the book. I set it up in 3 parts, 3 chapters to a part. And the first part is called, with a nod toward Raymond Carver, what we talk about when we talk about noise, a basic introduction. And in that section, I try to define what noise is. And different people have come up with different definitions, and I play around with those. And defining noise is always interesting because noise has subjective and objective components. We all know that what one person might call noise isn't noise to another. And it's interesting that as I was getting ready to hit the road this morning, on the day before Mother's Day, I thought of my own mother, still living, now in her 80s, who at one point in her life had to listen every single morning to one side of Jimi Hendrix's Are You Experienced, as played by her son, and as I recall, never once called it noise, though I knew other mothers of friends of mine who were not that tactful. But there is also an objective component to noise because noise is sound, and sound is a measurable phenomenon. And one of the things that interests me about this subject that I think is useful for other kinds of discussions and arguments is noise says, on the one hand, there is such a thing as relativity when we're talking about values, that not all people think the same things about the same subject. Nevertheless, there is a kind of threshold to that relativity. It does hit one absolute, and the absolute is this, that prolonged exposure to sounds of 85 to decibels or above causes noise-induced hearing loss.